The Vicarage cat vanished at noon. A Miss Marple story, section 1. The last cup of Darjeeling, it began, as so many such things do on a Thursday that had no reason to be memorable. The village of Dovecote Lee sat quietly under a sky of pressed linen, gray, the kind that threatened rain without quite delivering it. Birds chirped dutifully, but without enthusiasm, and the breeze that blew through hedgerows carried the faintest trace of overripe lilacs and morning toast. Mrs. Maud Culpepper's Thursday ladies' luncheon had concluded as routinely as it had for the past 7 years, a respectable tradition now, attended by the kind of women who wore soft pastel jumpers and knew the exact circumference of the scones at the tea shop, larger than last month, if you asked Mrs. Apersham. The chatter had ranged from the bishop's wife's swollen ankles to rumors that young Ralph Tewkesbury had been seen in London, wearing trousers with pleats as the ladies filed out through the iron gate that separated the Culpeper garden from the village lane. The air grew dense with parting phrases and murmured judgments. "Did you see how flustered Clara Finch was?" whispered Mrs. Dawes, pressing her gloved hand lightly to her bosom, as though to hold in the observation. Could hardly hold her cup steady. "It's her nerves," Mrs. Elspeth Moffat replied knowingly, "or that wretched tonic her cousin sends from Wales. I told her before, don't meddle with anything herbal unless you've grown it yourself." "And did you notice her handbag?" piped in Miss Horatia Pym, narrowing her eyes. "I'd swear it wasn't the one she normally carries. Looked new." Mrs. Apersham, who had been lingering by the rose trellis pretending to deadhead blooms, stiffened slightly. "New, is it? That explains the tag I saw dangling from it earlier." Honestly, Clara always did have a taste for the flashy, even now with poor Geoffrey barely a year gone. Miss Marple, seated on her usual bench near the post office, observed the procession with the mildest hint of a smile. She appeared wholly absorbed in her knitting, a gray lace shawl in the Shetland style, but her eyes were busy cataloguing expressions, gait, and the precise weight of certain phrases. Clara Finch's handbag, she noted mentally, had been crocodile-patterned. Leather artificial, of course, but clearly purchased recently. And Clara had looked nervous. Not the kind of nervous brought on by caffeine or gossip, but the kind of nervous that made one glance too often toward the Vicarage at the heart of the vicarage. The Reverend Lionel Humphrey was reviewing his upcoming sermon, Faith, Doubt, and the Punctual Soul, with a mechanical pencil and a frown. Though his thoughts were mostly preoccupied with an unfortunate phrasing involving sheep and shepherds, he was half aware that something was missing. The mantel clock struck 12. He glanced to the sideboard. No Solomon the Reverend's cat. A portly ginger named Solomon, with suspiciously pristine paws, had a certain haughty grace, had a deep spiritual attachment to mealtimes. At precisely noon, every day without exception, Solomon would emerge from the garden, push open the kitchen door with his substantial head, and demand luncheon. That he had not appeared was disquieting. "Solomon?" the Reverend called gently. There was no answering meow. The Reverend sighed, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He shuffled to the garden door and peered out. The rose beds were neatly trimmed, and the trellis over the walkway had begun to bud again. The air smelt faintly of rosemary and sun-warmed stone, but of Solomon there was no sign. "Perhaps he's climbed into the coal bin again," the Reverend muttered, already bracing himself for a ruined cushion or another apology to Mrs. Gibbs. The housekeeper, but the coal bin was closed. The sacristy was empty. The chair by the Aga remained unsat upon and suspiciously hair-free. Even the old prayer bench beneath the kitchen window, where Solomon often sulked when the Reverend had sermon-writing duties, was vacant. The vicarage cat had vanished. By 12:30. Constable Timms had heard it. Missing, you say? He repeated, scribbling dutifully in his little notebook outside the vicarage gate. Not missing in the criminal sense, said Reverend Humphrey, pulling his cardigan tighter over his collar. But Solomon is not prone to wandering. You see, he dislikes change or wind. Timms considered this, then jotted something illegible. Maybe he followed a mouse. Highly unlikely, said the Reverend. He has never shown an interest in such pursuits. Well, cats are mysterious, sir, said the constable. Sometimes they go where they're needed, and sometimes they go where they shouldn't, muttered the Reverend, casting a glance at the far garden wall where the ivy grew thickest. By mid-afternoon, the entire village had heard. The message, like all good Dovecote lead gossip, had traveled by carrier pigeon, milk van, and church. Newsletter, unofficially. At the tea shop, opinion was divided. Cats don't just vanish, said Mrs. Dalrymple to Mrs. Frobisher over crumpets. No, but people do, said Mrs. Frobisher darkly. What's that supposed to mean? Only that I saw Clara Finch go, behind the vicarage wall after luncheon. What was she doing there, I wonder? Good heavens! Are you suggesting she took the cat? Mrs. Frobisher blinked. I wasn't, but now that you mention it. The doorbell jingled as Lucy Minton entered, cheeks flushed. She was a newcomer to the village 2 years, unmarried, worked remotely as a translator for a publishing firm, and was viewed with a blend of suspicion and reluctant admiration by the older ladies. She ordered a scone and quietly read the latest. Daily Herald ignoring the stares at the post office. Miss Marple handed in 2 letters for her nephew, Raymond, and lingered a moment by the community notice board. Her eyes slid over the neatly pinned announcements. Boot sale at the village hall, help wanted at the allotments, and tucked in the corner a half-torn flyer for a missing parakeet from last spring. The cat was not on the board. Not yet. But something else caught her attention. A small corner of a linen handkerchief was sticking out from behind the board, a dainty one, with a faint monogram embroidered in purple thread. C.F. Miss Marple tucked it into her handbag. She never believed in coincidence. Not in matters of disappearance. By 6 o'clock, the sun dipped behind the hedge line, and the air cooled with purpose. A hush began to settle. It was then that Alice Gibbs screamed. The Reverend dropped his spoon mid-dinner. He found Alice out back, white-faced and gesturing wildly toward the corner of the churchyard, where ivy hung thick along the ancient stone wall. Behind it, in the space between the kitchen garden and the cemetery, was a hollow depression normally used for compost. Today it was not empty. Something pale and limp lay, twisted awkwardly among the vines. It was the body of Mrs. Clara Finch. She was lying face down, her arm curled beneath her, and the expression on her face, not visible at first, was one of surprise rather than terror. Her scarf was missing. Her handbag was gone. Her shoes, curiously, were dry, even though the soil beneath her was damp with dew. Inspector Howard, called in from Little Darnley, arrived just before dusk. He had seen 3 deaths that week and had hoped Dovecote Lie might provide a quieter case. Time of death? He asked the village doctor, who stood stiffly nearby. Sometime between noon and 2, I'd say. The same time the cat went. Missing, Howard noted, scratching his head. Yes, said Constable Timms uneasily. Funny, that. But Miss Marple, standing quietly just behind the hedgerow, didn't find it funny at all. She found it troubling, because things did not disappear in Dovecote Lay without reason, especially not at noon. Section 2, the village, reacts by the following morning. The news had traveled like a wind-borne seed, drifting through lace-curtained parlors, down cobbled lanes, and straight into the teacups of every soul in Dovecote Lee. Clara Finch was dead. The circumstances, found sprawled behind the ivy-laced vicarage wall with no witnesses, no immediate cause of death, and a missing handbag, would have been scandal enough. But when paired with the earlier disappearance of Solomon the vicarage cat, it became, to the village mind, nothing short of a full-blown mystery. Strangled, I'll bet, said Mrs. Apersham grimly, pouring herself a second cup of assam at the tea shop. That's what happens to women with secrets. They're strangled. What secrets would Clara have? Asked Mrs. Frobisher, though the gleam in her eye betrayed a hope that the answer would be shocking. She always was a strange one, muttered Horatia Pym, smoothing the folds of her mauve skirt. Twitchy, fond of too much lavender, and those letters she was always posting abroad, weren't they? No, said Mrs. Dalrymple firmly, who had once borrowed Clara's mending kit and still felt vaguely indebted. She was lonely, that's all, and loneliness plays on the nerves. From a table by the window, Miss Marple looked up briefly from her scone. Her tea had grown cool, but she didn't seem to notice. She had been watching the way Mrs. Apersham's knuckles had whitened as she spoke, the way Horatia Pym had not, in fact, denied knowing about the letters, merely implied. And most telling of all, the way Mrs. Dalrymple had kept her eyes averted when Clara's name had been spoken. Grief, Miss Marple thought, combs in many shades, but guilt wears a particular one. She made a note in the margin of her mind and returned to her scone, adding only the faintest murmur. Such a pity. She had a most intelligent mind, Clara. The table fell quiet for a moment. No one liked being reminded that the recently departed had once been human, especially if they'd had opinions of their own. At the vicarage, the Reverend Humphrey was pacing. Solomon has still not returned, he said for the 3rd time that hour, wringing his hands. Alice Gibbs, pale and subdued, offered him a cup of warm milk. I'm sure he's hiding, sir. They say animals know when something terrible has happened. The Reverend sighed and took the cup. He looked older than he had the day before. His habitual cheerfulness dimmed beneath a shadow of unease. The sacristy had been scrubbed, and yet the scent of something mineral and cloying still lingered. Have the police found anything? He asked quietly. Alice hesitated. Only that she wasn't robbed. And the doctor, well, they say he's not entirely sure. Not sure of what? How she died. The milk cooled in the Reverend's hands. Then it wasn't her heart? No, sir. He sat heavily in the armchair by the hearth. I prayed with her once, Clara, after Geoffrey passed. She asked if I believed in signs. Do you know, I didn't know how to answer her. Alice nodded solemnly. She always seemed to be looking for something. Across the village, The police were beginning their inquiries with the delicate tact of elephants in a tea room. Inspector Howard had returned with Sergeant Finchley from Little Darnley, and was now seated in the parlor of Mrs. Maud Culpepper, whose lace doilies bristled under the weight of official scrutiny. "You say she left the luncheon at what time, Mrs. Culpepper?" Howard asked, peering over his spectacles. "Oh, just after 1, Maud said crisply. She seemed distracted, flushed. I assumed it was the heat. Was there any sort of ... disagreement?" "Certainly not. We discussed quite ordinary things. The lack of rain, a new variety of peony. She complimented my jam sponge. It was, in every way, a typical afternoon." Howard flipped a page. "Who else was in attendance?" Maud hesitated. "Well, naturally Mrs. Appersham, Horatia Pym, Elspeth Moffat, and Mrs. Dalrymple. Oh, and Lucy Menton, though I dare say she doesn't really belong to the luncheon circle. She often keeps to herself. Still, she was present." "Yes." "And? You noticed nothing unusual?" Maud paused. "Only that Clara seemed frightened. But you must understand, Clara was often nervous. Since Geoffrey died, she hadn't been quite herself." Howard scribbled something. "Had she mentioned anyone following her?" "Any threats? Certainly not," though Maud pursed her lips. "She had been asking some rather odd questions." "What sort of questions?" "About the church grounds, old graves, the crypt under the vestry. Nonsense, really." The inspector straightened. "The crypt?" "Yes. She said she'd seen someone leaving it. A man in dark clothing. But when she pointed, there was no one there." Howard glanced at Finchley. "Did she name him?" "She said it might have been Mr. Harding." "Who is Mr. Harding?" "The organist." That same morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the churchyard. Not to pray, though she did pause for a moment near the statue of St. Hilda, but to look, quietly, the ivy wall, still slightly crushed where Clara Finch's body had been discovered, offered little beyond bruised leaves and a broken vine stem. Miss Marple examined it with careful hands, noting a small patch of disturbed earth near the base of the wall, too shallow for a grave, but perhaps enough to conceal something smaller. She didn't dig. Not yet. Instead, she walked along the narrow lane that ran behind the cemetery, her pace slow and reflective. A few feet ahead, she spotted Lucy Menton emerging from the path that led to the allotments. The younger woman startled slightly when she saw her. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're out early." "I always am, my dear," Miss Marple said with a kind smile. "The air is far more honest before noon." Lucy laughed nervously. "I suppose it is." They walked together in companionable silence for a few paces before Miss Marple asked, as though it had only just occurred to her, "Did you notice anything strange after the luncheon yesterday?" Lucy hesitated. Clara Finch left in rather a hurry. She almost dropped her bag. "Yes, I'd heard it was a new one." "It was," Lucy said, eyes narrowing slightly. "But she wasn't holding it the last time I saw her." "Oh?" "I passed her by the east gate, heading toward the vicarage. She looked flustered and empty-handed." "How curious," said Miss Marple mildly. "Most women are rather protective of new handbags, don't you find?" "Yes," Lucy said slowly. "That's why I remembered it." They parted ways near the post office, but Miss Marple's expression, as she turned toward the bakery, had grown more pensive. Clara Finch had left the tea with a new handbag and had been seen shortly after without it. The bag had not been found on the body, nor had Solomon the cat. A handbag could be discarded, but a cat? Miss Marple had known a man once in St. Mary Mead who had kept letters tucked in the lining of an umbrella stand, another who'd hidden jewelry in an old piano pedal. People underestimated small spaces and small animals. That afternoon, word spread that the police were searching Mr. Harding's cottage. The organist, a thin, stoop-shouldered man with a talent for batch and an aversion to strong sunlight, had reportedly been seen in the vicinity of the crypt the previous day. "I'll bet it's him," said Cyril Norridge at the grocer's. "Never liked the way he plays the offertory. Too morbid." "Doesn't mean he's a killer," grunted Mr. Beasley, weighing out pears. "All the same, it's strange," muttered Cyril. "And what about that cat, eh? Disappears 1 minute. A dead woman the next. There's a connection. I'd stake my pension on it." No one quite knew what that connection might be, but in Dovecote Lay, uncertainty had never stopped anyone from having an opinion at twilight. Miss Marple sat by her window, a fresh pot of tea steeping beside her, and Solomon's absence weighing more heavily than she cared to admit. She opened her notebook and wrote a single line: "A cat, a crypt, and a handbag." She underlined the middle word twice. The Vicarage cat had vanished at noon. So had Clara Finch, but only one had returned, and the village was just beginning to notice. Section 3. Early investigation. The morning after the police had questioned Mr. Harding, the sun returned to Dovecote Lye with unapologetic brightness, bathing the church steeple and the vicarage in a golden sheen that seemed wholly at odds with the tension that hung in the air. Miss Marple, as was her habit, rose early and took her walk along the eastern lane bordering the churchyard, pausing to admire the wisteria spilling like lavender waterfalls over the low stone wall. A bee buzzed lazily nearby. The world, it seemed, had resumed its usual rhythm, but in truth, nothing in the village had returned to normal. Not yet. In the drawing-room of the vicarage, Reverend Humphrey sat with his spectacles pushed up into his hair and a furrow on his brow. He was reading, for perhaps the 5th time, the note from the bishop's office that expressed polite sympathy for the unfortunate events and requested a swift return to spiritual calm. Alice Gibbs, seated across from him with a ledger in her lap, seemed equally distracted. "It's not that people are frightened exactly," she said, "but more restless. I heard 3 separate accounts this morning of Clara having been seen walking with someone the day before she died. None of them agree on who." The Reverend groaned softly. "And Solomon? No sign." Alice hesitated before adding, "But someone reported seeing a ginger cat in the old Miller barn last night." "The barn's been abandoned for decades." "Yes, but the door's been pried open." The Reverend rubbed his temple. "Perhaps we should tell Miss Marple." "I already did," said Alice, with a faint smile. That afternoon, the inspector returned for a second round of questioning, this time turning his attention to Lucy Minton. She received him in her modest cottage near the riverbank, its shelves stacked with gardening books and her solitary armchair draped in a tartan shawl. "I didn't really know Clara," she said, setting down a tray of tea with practiced economy of motion. "We were acquaintances, nothing more." Inspector Howard nodded. "You were at the luncheon, as were 6 others." "Yes, but you were the last to leave." Lucy's brow furrowed. Who told you that? He didn't answer directly. Where did you go afterward? I walked along the east lane. I passed Clara by the vicarage wall. Did you speak to her? No, Lucy said quickly. She seemed preoccupied. Howard watched her closely. Had you noticed anything unusual in Clara's behavior recently? She asked strange questions, but Clara always asked strange questions. That wasn't new. Such as, Lucy sighed, about the old cemetery register, about names from over a century ago. She came to the library once looking for records. Do you know if she found anything? I don't think so. She seemed frustrated. Howard jotted something down. Thank you, Miss Minton. But as he left, Miss Marple, seated in the shade of a nearby sycamore with a crochet project she had not yet started, observed the slight tremble in Lucy's hand as she closed the door. It wasn't fear, she thought. It was something else, a kind of anticipation, as though Lucy was waiting for something or someone to arrive. Meanwhile, the townspeople continued to speculate, as they always did. Horatia Pym had taken to wearing darker shades of purple and declaring Clara Finch's death an omen. Mrs. Apersham, who had once sold Clara a crystal pendant to aid with sleep, now swore she had felt an unnatural chill pass through her parlor the night of the murder, in the snug of the Fox and Gown, the village's only public house. Mr. Beasley the grocer leaned across the bar to confide in Cyril Norridge. They say it wasn't murder at all, he whispered. They say she fell, hit her head. Don't be daft, Cyril muttered. You fall, you leave marks. There were no marks. And what about the bag and the cat? It is strange about that cat, ... And what about the crypt? There's something unholy about it, I swear. Mr. Beasley looked around nervously. You think she found something? Something someone didn't want her to? Cyril sipped his bitter and muttered, Wouldn't be the first time bones have made trouble. And a churchyard. That evening, Miss Marple visited the Reverend under the pretense of returning a book on Victorian hymnals, and over tea in the sunlit study she gently steered the conversation. I do hope Solomon returns, she said softly. Animals have a way of disappearing when there's unpleasantness. The Reverend gave a faint, sad smile. He was such a comfort to Clara, you know. She once told me he was the only soul who truly understood her. She must have been quite lonely, I think. Yes, but it was more than that. She looked for things, Miss Marple. She believed in patterns and signs. She saw stories where others saw only routine. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did she ever mention the crypt to you? He blinked. Once or twice. She asked whether it had ever been consecrated. I told her it had. And she didn't believe you? He hesitated. She asked if there had ever been improper burials, centuries ago, I mean. I told her I didn't know. There's no record of such things. Only stories. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Stories have more truth in them than we sometimes like to admit. The following morning, something peculiar happened. Miss Marple awoke before dawn, as was her custom, and found a parcel left at her doorstep. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, and unmarked. Inside was a scrap of what had once been lace curtain, identical to the kind used in Clara Finch's parlor. Tucked within it was a folded page from an old church newsletter, dated 1901. It bore a single sentence highlighted in faint blue ink. and thus the widow who spoke of shadows was laid to rest in the unblessed soil behind the east wall. Miss Marple stared at the paper for a long time before gently folding it and tucking it inside her notebook. She had always believed that human nature was unchanging, that the sins of the past had a way of staining the present, and it seemed Clara Finch had believed the same. The question was who else did. Section 4. A hidden clue. The village was quieter than usual that morning, though it was not the quiet of peace. Rather, it was the hush of held breath, the kind of uneasy silence that lingers after a curtain falls, but before the applause begins. In Dovecote Lee, that silence took the form of curt nods, whispers over fences, and eyes that darted away a heartbeat too quickly. Miss Marple, however, took no notice of any unease. She was in the vicarage garden with a pair of pruning shears and a linen sun hat slightly too large for her head, snipping at the overgrown boxwood hedge near the eastern wall. She had asked the Reverend if she might help tidy the neglected bed, where Clara Finch had once planted herbs for the church's harvest supper. "It's quite therapeutic," she'd said, trimming away what no longer belongs. By mid-morning she had cleared the lower tangle of weeds and uncovered the edge of a stone path, half swallowed by soil and time. She paused, brushing earth from her gloves, and squinted at a strange depression in the earth beside the path. It was narrow and sharply edged, like a groove formed by repeated scraping. Beside it, something glinted dully in the soil. Kneeling, she reached for it and retrieved a small, rusted brass object. At first glance, it looked like the curved edge of a broken locket or pendant, but on closer inspection, it proved to be a key plate, the decorative brass trim that surrounds the keyhole of an old door or cabinet. Miss Marple turned it over, her hand brushing away flecks of earth. The back was blackened with age. It wasn't a valuable object by any stretch, yet it struck her as oddly out of place. The Reverend approached from the porch, wiping his hands with a linen cloth. "You've made more progress than I have all week," he said with a smile. Miss Marple gave him a gentle nod and gestured to the brass plate. "Do you happen to know what this might have belonged to?" It was just beside the herb bed. He peered at it, frowning. "No idea, though the old crypt has a number of doors and wooden panels, some in dreadful condition. Perhaps something was removed from down there?" He hesitated, as though uncomfortable. "I suppose it's possible. Clara had been quite insistent about the crypt, you know. Wanted to go down several times. I discouraged her." "Why? There are rotted stairs. The flooring's uneven. And frankly, there's nothing down there worth visiting. Old stone, forgotten pews. No relics. Just dust." Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze drifted toward the stone archway at the back of the church, one that led to the narrow passage and the steps down. There was dust, perhaps, but dust often concealed far more than cobwebs. Meanwhile, Inspector Howard had his own discoveries. He had returned to the late Clara Finch's cottage to examine her books, papers, and effects for anything that might explain her final hours. The place was musty with the scent of unopened rooms and drying flowers. Dust motes danced in the filtered light streaming through the drawn curtains. On her writing desk he found a worn leather notebook with pressed violets between the pages, and several entries written in Clara's peculiar, looping script. August 3rd. He said the widow was buried behind the east wall. The record is gone, but the dates do not match. They never match. August 7th. Solomon hissed when I showed him the scrap. Animals remember, I am certain. August 12th. I saw Lucy again. She avoids the garden gate. Always has, always will. I wonder what she saw. Howard blinked. Lucy Minton again. Clara's final entry, dated the morning of her death. Simply read, the key is always in what people believe they've forgotten. He copied the notes into his report and requested the crypt be opened for formal inspection. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Lucy Minton, ostensibly to borrow a book on English folklore. The cottage was tidy and spare, much like Lucy herself. A fire crackled, though the day was warm. "I didn't expect you, Miss Marple," Lucy said, folding a tea towel neatly. "But you're always welcome." "You were quite right," Miss Marple began, about Clara asking strange questions. "I believe she truly thought there was something wrong in the church records." Lucy poured tea, her hands steady now. "Well, she was certainly fixated. She had a great many notes, you know, and your name appeared more than once." That stopped Lucy short. Her expression flickered, just for a moment. She often misinterpreted things. "She mentioned you avoided the garden gate." "That you always had." Lucy smiled thinly. "I've always used the front. I don't care for walking past the crypt." "Most people don't," Miss Marple agreed. "Strange, isn't it, how things linger? Not ghosts, precisely, but guilt, memory." Lucy looked down into her teacup. "Did Clara ever mention anything about Solomon going near the crypt?" Miss Marple asked. "No. Why?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Oh, no particular reason. But animals, I've found, have a remarkable sense of unease around places they don't trust." Lucy didn't respond, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightness in her jaw, the only betrayal of tension. She left a short while later, thanking Lucy for her time. As she walked back toward her cottage, her thoughts returned to the brass key, plate, the missing crypt record, and the line in Clara's notebook. The key is always in what people believe they've forgotten. She wondered what Lucy Minton had forgotten. At the church, workmen began clearing the crypt. It was slow, careful work. Reverend Humphrey hovered anxiously, wringing his hands, while Inspector Howard supervised. Several old pews were removed, cobwebbed and splintering. At the far end of the room stood a narrow door, half-rotted, its iron latch coated in rust. The ground nearby, a faint impression in the dust, suggested something once hung there, a small frame or plate. Long gone. Howard reached for the latch, but it didn't budge. Locked. The Reverend stepped forward. "That door hasn't opened in decades." Miss Marple, who had arrived without a word and stood quietly observing near the steps, cleared her throat gently. "I wonder, Inspector, if it once bore a decorative key plate? Something not unlike this." She produced the brass object she had found earlier. The inspector took it, comparing it to the faint outline on the wood. "A match," he muttered. "And no sign of the key itself?" "No," he said, puzzled. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the door was not meant to be reopened." Howard stared at her. "You think this is important?" "I think," she replied, "that Miss Finch believed something was hidden, and that whoever killed her believed she might discover it." She said no more, but in her mind the pieces were starting to align quietly. Precisely, and terribly. Section 5. Confrontations and secrets. The crypt remained locked, though the brass key plate Miss Marple had discovered fit the outline upon the old door perfectly. The actual key to the chamber beyond was nowhere to be found. Inspector Howard, after consulting with the bishop's office, ordered the door left undisturbed for now. There's no cause to go breaking ancient hinges until we have something more substantial than theories, he told the Reverend, though his own unease was beginning to show. He had grown wary of the shape the mystery was beginning to take, a shape that resembled not a clean circle, but an inward spiral. Meanwhile, in Dovecote Lee, it seemed that secrets were starting to slip from places even older than the crypt. It was Mrs. Apersham who first noticed that the widow Trenholm had begun wearing gloves again, despite the warming weather. She mentioned it over coffee to Horatia Pym, who immediately assumed a scandal was afoot. "I'm telling you," said Horatia, "she's hiding something. Fingernails, perhaps? Or scratches? Scratches?" Mrs. Apersham's eyes widened. "From a cat," whispered Horatia. "Clara's cat. You know how animals sense guilt." The suggestion was absurd, but not entirely unwelcome in the gossipy air of the village. By tea-time that day, 3 people swore they had seen the widow skulking along the vicarage hedge on the day of Clara's death, and 1 boy claimed to have seen her dropping a packet into the brook. None of it was confirmed. All of it was repeated. Miss Marple heard it all, of course, as she sat in the corner of the village shop, pretending to inspect a spool of darning thread. She said nothing, though she did make a note of the fact that the widow Trenholm, ordinarily a woman who loved to be at the center of chatter, had been conspicuously absent from her usual seat on the church pew. Later that week, Miss Marple paid a visit to the widow under the pretense of returning a borrowed gardening book. The cottage on Mill Lane was shaded and damp, smelling faintly of lavender and mothballs. Mrs. Trenholm received her with her usual poise, though. Her hands were indeed sheathed in pale gray kid gloves. "It's my arthritis, dear," she said airily when Miss Marple commented on the gloves. "Cold spring stiff joints," Miss Marple smiled gently. "I quite understand. Cold hands and secrets neither do well in open air." The widow blinked. "Beg pardon?" "Oh, just an old saying," Miss Marple murmured. "I always think that villages are like patchwork quilts. You never know which square hides the torn bit until you look closely." There was a pause. A clock ticked somewhere behind them. "I understand Clara Finch may have asked you for some church records?" The widow's expression turned guarded. She was always asking questions. Had some obsession with the Finch family history. Something about a reverend from the 1800s claimed he was improperly buried. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And you discouraged her?" "She was chasing ghosts, Miss Marple. And as you know, ghosts never bring comfort." "Only answers," Miss Marple said gently. The widow rose too quickly. "Would you care for biscuit?" "No, thank you, dear." She watched the older woman's hands tremble as she poured more tea, the gray glove wrinkling like creased parchment. That evening, as dusk crept over Dovecote Lee, the Reverend and Inspector Howard met in the study of the vicarage. A letter had arrived from the diocesan archives. It had been sent in reply to a quiet query the Reverend had placed the week prior, after a nudge from Miss Marple herself. The contents were brief but illuminating. The crypt beneath St. Cuthbert's was sealed partially in 1911 following rumors. of improper interments during the late Victorian period. Records from 1884 to 1892 were purged by order of the presiding archdeacon, citing doctrinal irregularities. One name, however, appears frequently in marginalia: Rev. Nathaniel Finch. Clara's ancestor? The Reverend asked. Inspector Howard nodded. It would appear so. And what does doctrinal irregularity mean, exactly? Howard rubbed the back of his neck. Likely something to do with unofficial burials or even unblessed rites. The Victorians were fond of burying their secrets, quite literally. The Reverend looked pale. What was Clara trying to prove? That the sins of her family were covered up by the church, perhaps, Howard said, or that someone else was. They fell into silence, the fire crackling faintly in the grate. Then Howard added, Miss Marple believes someone feared she would succeed. Miss Marple was, at that moment, taking tea with Alice Gibbs, who had returned from the post office looking unusually grim. There was an anonymous note left with the morning mail, Alice said, handing it to Miss Marple. It was addressed to me, but clearly not written by someone I know. The paper was coarse, and the words had been typed on a clunky typewriter. Stop asking about the cat. It has nothing to do with her death. Let sleeping things lie. Miss Marple read it twice, then handed it back. Very curious. Solomon has been gone for nearly a fortnight. I suppose someone thinks he saw too much. Alice looked shaken. Can that be true? Miss Marple gave her a kind, steely look. My dear, animals often see what humans choose to overlook. 2 nights later, Solomon returned. He appeared, as cats often do, without announcement or apology. Alice found him curled up on the vicarage steps just after sundown, eyes gleaming in the lamplight. He was thinner, and his fur matted, but he was unmistakably himself. Alice knelt beside him. Solomon, where have you been? He did not answer, of course, but he let her scoop him into her arms. Miss Marple arrived moments later, summoned by Alice's call. I don't suppose you've seen where he came from? Miss Marple asked. No, he just appeared. Miss Marple bent to examine the cat more closely. There was a small burr tangled in the fur behind his right ear. She plucked it gently, examined it. Which weed, she murmured, grows near the Miller barn and in the old crypt gardens. She looked into Solomon's luminous eyes. You clever boy. Then she rose and turned to Alice. I believe we must visit the crypt again, quietly, tonight. Section 6. Beneath the stone, the church clock struck 11, its chimes muffled by the thick June air that hung like a damp shawl across Dovecote. Lamplight shimmered along the worn cobblestones, but most of the village lay still, doors shut, curtains drawn, fires banked low. Only 2 figures moved silently through the side gate of St. Cuthbert's. Miss Marple walked steadily, lantern in one hand, carpet-bag in the other. Alice Gibbs followed, her steps light and careful, though her breath came in nervous little puffs. I still don't see why we can't wait for the police, Alice whispered. Because, Miss Marple replied softly, some things are best observed before others are alerted. One must allow certain truths to breathe freely, just for a moment, before they're snatched away by the air of officialdom. They slipped through the archway at the back of the church and into the narrow passage that led to the crypt. Alice shivered as the air grew colder. touched by damp stone and old dust. The crypt door was as it had been iron-rusted and fastened, but the screws on the brass lock plate had been loosened slightly since Miss Marple had last seen it. "I believe someone's been here," she said calmly, kneeling to inspect the lock, likely trying to remove what's hidden or perhaps put something in. She produced a set of tools from her bag. Alice's eyes widened. "Miss Marple, where on earth did you learn to pick a lock?" "My dear, do remember, I once belonged to the St. Mary Mead Amateur Dramatic Society. We did a rather elaborate staging of The Lady Vanishes. I played a governess who concealed passports in hollowed candlesticks." Alice gave a breathless chuckle, only slightly reassured. With surprising ease, the lock gave way and the door creaked, open on stubborn hinges, revealing a set of ancient stone steps descending into shadow. The smell was old earth and mildew, soaked wood and something coppery that neither of them mentioned aloud. Miss Marple lit the lantern and led the way. The crypt's interior was larger than Alice had expected, perhaps 20 feet wide, with arched alcoves along the sides and a low barrel-vaulted ceiling overhead. Dust coated everything. Muting detail and spider webs draped the edges of forgotten pews like faded lace dot. At the far end was a recess in the stone wall bare and sealed with a heavy iron plate bolted to the floor. "That's where the fence records say an additional chamber once stood," Miss Marple murmured. "And Clara believed someone had been buried there improperly?" Alice asked. Miss Marple nodded. "And not just improperly. Illegally." She stepped carefully across the crypt and held the lantern up to the recess wall. Her light caught the faint edge of a carved inscription. "Here lies the faithful servant, the keeper of sins." Alice drew in a breath. "There's no name," she whispered. "No," said Miss Marple. But Clara believed this was the burial place of Rev. Nathaniel Finch, who was censured and then erased from the diocesan record. But why hide that? Perhaps because he buried someone or something he shouldn't have. Or perhaps he was buried here in secret, denied rites. Miss Marple placed her gloved hand against the stone. And secrets like that are never buried as deep as people hope. Just then, Alice knelt down beside a small heap of disturbed dust at the base of the stone. Something glinted faintly in the lantern light. "It's a ring," she said, picking it up with a handkerchief. "A man's ring." Miss Marple took it, inspecting the tarnished gold band. Inside was a faint engraving. "Nanfa Finch," she said softly. "It's him. Someone's been down here, Alice. They tried to remove this and dropped it. That means they were here after the crypt was first disturbed. Then the killer returned," Alice said, "to retrieve evidence." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "or to make sure no one else would." The next morning the village was alive with speculation. Solomon's reappearance had not gone unnoticed, nor had the whispers about a secret visit to the crypt. The widow Trenholm had collapsed at the grocer's from what she claimed was a dizzy spell. Lucy Minton had not come to collect her morning eggs, and the vicar was overheard requesting an extra measure of brandy in his tea. Miss Marple, however, was perfectly composed. She sat quietly at the maple and thorn tea-room, sipping Earl Grey with a twist of lemon and waiting. It was not long before Mr. Edgar Halliwell appeared ostensibly to deliver the afternoon newspapers. He looked harried, his tie askew and his hands stained with ink. "Terrible business," he muttered to the room. "Terrible. Miss Marple looked up. "What's the trouble, Mr. Hollowell?" He blinked. "Oh, Miss Marple, you haven't heard? They're saying Clara Finch wrote to the Times weeks before she died. About the burial records. About the Finch scandal. It was never printed, but she kept a carbon copy." "How very careful of her," Miss Marple murmured. "And how very threatening to someone who hoped the matter would never be examined." Hollowell lowered his voice. "She mailed it from the old postbox on Bridge Lane. You know the one no one uses anymore." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Curious choice. Perhaps she didn't want to be seen," he added. "Or perhaps," Miss Marple said, "she wanted someone to find out." That evening, Miss Marple requested an audience with Inspector Howard and the Reverend Humphrey once more. "I believe," she began, "that we are not only dealing with a murder, but with the echo of a much older injustice, one that someone has carried for a very long time." Howard crossed his arms. "Go on." "You'll recall that Clara Finch believed the burial of Reverend Nathaniel Finch was improperly handled. She suspected records were altered. But that alone, while distressing, is not sufficient motive for murder." She folded her hands. "Unless the records concealed something worse." The Reverend looked pale. "Like what?" "A second burial. Someone buried alongside him. Perhaps a woman. Perhaps a child. Unrecorded. Illegitimate. Forgotten." Howard looked grim. "And someone was afraid that secret would come to light." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. Clara's questions, her notes, her visit to the crypt, they all pointed in one direction, toward uncovering a truth that someone believed could ruin a family, a legacy, or a conscience. Howard nodded slowly. So who had the most to lose? Miss Marple lifted the gold ring they'd found in the crypt. "Perhaps the answer lies in who once bore this." The Reverend's eyes widened. "That's my family crest." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "You are descended from the Finches, are you not?" "Yes," he said, suddenly hoarse. "Nathaniel Finch was my great-grand-uncle. And Clara Finch believed the Finch line had been corrupted. She believed someone was buried down there whose very existence had been erased." Howard straightened. "So are you saying Humphrey?" Miss Marple raised a calming hand. "No, I believe Reverend Humphrey knew nothing of this, but someone else in the village did." She looked toward the window, where the wisteria rustled faintly in the breeze. "And I believe," she said softly, "they've waited a long time to silence the past." Section 7. A whisper in the parlor. It was a quiet sort of Thursday, one of those mild English afternoons when the sky offers no clear opinion on whether to rain or not, and the scent of cut grass carries on a breeze that seems to come from no direction in particular. Dovecote Lee seemed to have collectively taken a breath, though not necessarily one of relief. News of Clara Finch's carbon-copied letter had reached more ears than Miss Marple would have liked. There had been no leak from the inspector's office. She was sure Inspector Howard struck her as quietly thorough, with an honest man's dismay for gossip. But in a village like this, whispers didn't need truth to grow. They needed only suggestion. Still, the most dangerous thing in Dovecote Lee wasn't gossip. It was guilt. And Miss Marple knew it had a peculiar way of clinging like a burr to a cat's coat, overlooked until suddenly unmistakably present. That morning she invited 3 of her acquaintances for tea. She never used the word suspects. That would have been vulgar. Horatio Pym arrived first, dressed in a navy cardigan and crisp pearls. She was unusually quiet, though she pretended to cheer. "I must say, dear, your rose garden is quite enviable this season," she offered, nodding toward the open window. Miss Marple smiled. "The secret, I find, is old habits and good compost. Much like people, really." Horatio blinked, perhaps uncertain whether to laugh. Next came Edgar Hallowell, who had apparently taken great pains with his appearance. His tie was freshly knotted, his cuffs unspotted for once, though ink still stained his fingertips. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Lovely day for a gathering, though I dare say the village's mood is gloomier than your tea service." "Tea does help restore one's clarity," Miss Marple said mildly, pouring him a cup. "And what's more comforting than a few biscuits and the company of friends, H.M.? Lastly, the widow Trenholm arrived gloved still, though today in beige rather than gray. Her manner was composed, but there was a tremor in her voice when she greeted Miss Marple. The moment she sat, her eyes flitted from Edgar to Horatio and back, like a cat eyeing the drawing room before the fire is lit. The stage was set. "I've been thinking," Miss Marple began, passing around the plate of lemon shortbread, "about Clara's disappearance, or rather her death." Horatio Pym tensed, but said nothing. "Such a tragic thing," Edgar muttered, eyes down. The widow lifted her chin. "She meddled, that girl. Some people can't leave things be." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Indeed. And yet she was quite right, I think, in suspecting that something was amiss beneath St. Cuthbert's." Edgar stiffened. Miss Marple continued, "Of course, if you believe in ghosts, the past has a way of returning all on its own. But I find it's usually people who bring it back. People with old memories, or old debts." She set down her teacup with a delicate clink. "You see, Clara told me something curious the week before she died. She said someone had written to her, anonymously. She never said who, but she seemed shaken. She said it was someone inside the village, someone who knew things they shouldn't." The room seemed to shift. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock marked time. Miss Marple folded her hands. "She said the writer warned her not to speak to anyone about the year 1889. Edgar's teacup rattled slightly as he set it down too quickly. Strange thing to mention. Could be anyone one of those cranks who read historical novels and think themselves clever. "Quite," Miss Marple said agreeably. "But curious that the crypt records were sealed precisely that year." Horatio stood suddenly. I really must be going. There's a custard I've left in the oven." "Oh, do sit down, Horatio," said Miss Marple gently. "The custard will be fine. I believe what I'm about to say may interest you as well." Reluctantly, Horatio sat. "Yesterday evening," Miss Marple said evenly, "Solomon the vicarage cat returned home with a bit of burr caught behind his ear. Witchweed, the type that grows only in the hedgerow near the Miller barn, and in the forgotten garden atop the old crypt." She let that hang for a moment. "Someone's been going there. Recently." No one spoke. I imagine they were looking for something. Or perhaps burying it. "Burying what?" Edgar asked sharply. Miss Marple smiled thinly. "That is the question, isn't it?" When they'd gone, Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the path where each of her guests had vanished. Horatio had left hurriedly, clutching her handbag like a life-preserver. Edgar lingered, pretending to tie his shoe. And the widow, well, the widow had walked very slowly, pausing at the rose arbor before disappearing down Mill Lane. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace with Solomon curled beside her, her knitting needles forgotten in her lap. Something was beginning to form, faintly, like the outline of a watermark on fine paper. Horatio Pym's late husband had been churchwarden in the 1960s. Edgar Hollowell's uncle had been the parish clerk in 1952, and widow Trenholme's brother long dead, but not forgotten, had once served as assistant to the diocesan archivist. The same archivist who had purged the records Clara Finch had so desperately sought. 3 people. 3 quiet links to an older silence, but one of them had struck her in just the wrong way. When Miss Marple had said, "Burying something, Edgar," Hollowell's eyes had flicked, not with confusion, but alarm. He had understood. The next morning brought more than fog. It brought Reverend Humphrey himself to Miss Marple's front garden, looking unusually flustered. "I've received an anonymous envelope," he said without greeting. "Left on the vicarage doorstep." He handed it to her. The paper was the same cheap pulp as the note Alice had received, but this one contained a photograph. It was of the crypt garden, taken from a strange angle, and in the corner of the photo, nearly obscured by shadow, was a pale hand, just visible through the soil. Miss Marple looked up. "This changes everything. Is it a real hand?" the Reverend asked, visibly pale. "I believe so." "Then we must go to the police." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her expression unreadable. "But not just yet." She folded the photograph and tucked it into her sleeve. "We must do something first." "Do what?" She turned to him. "We must ask Edgar Hollowell about his typewriter." Section 8. The ghost of a typewriter. The next morning dawned still and pewter gray, with a soft drizzle tapping steadily at the window panes of Dovecote Lee. The sort of weather, Miss Marple often thought, that encouraged reflection or secrets. It was not a day for action so much as revelation. She stood at her writing desk, folding the photograph Reverend Humphrey had delivered the day before. The image still disturbed her, not merely for what it revealed, a pale hand in the dirt above the crypt garden, but for what it suggested. The hand had not simply been buried. It had been positioned just so, with fingers half curled and thumb visible. There had been care in the concealment. Someone wanted it found, but not too soon. Just enough to send a message. It was the message that disturbed her most. She turned to Solomon, who watched her from the hearthrug, flicking his tail. "Very well, Solomon," she said. "Let's pay Mr. Hollowell a visit." The Hollowell house stood just off Pudding Lane, behind a screen of overgrown hawthorn hedges, and flanked by a rusting iron gate that gave a disconcerting squeal as Miss Marple pushed it open. The front garden, though once tidy, had fallen into disrepair. Weeds curled up through the flagstones, and the rose bushes had grown wild. She knocked gently. After a delay, Edgar Hollowell opened the door, dressed in a cardigan of suspiciously mismatched buttons and smelling faintly of turpentine. "Miss Marple," he said, blinking. "What a surprise. I do hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Oh, no, just doing some reorganizing. The printing press gets dustier every day." He stepped aside, allowing her in. The hallway was narrow and lined with leaning Stacks of yellowing parish newsletters, town circulars, and forgotten newsletters from causes long defunct. The faint smell of ink and aging paper hung in the air. "Would you mind terribly," she said, once they reached the sitting room, "if I asked about your typewriter?" Edgar paused. "My typewriter? Yes, I've always admired the elegance of older models. You've used yours for the parish newsletter for decades, haven't you?" "I have, yes." He gestured vaguely toward the back room. "It's in the study. Might I see it?" He hesitated. "I'm afraid it's rather a mess," he said, rubbing his neck. "I haven't had time to oil it lately." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "I do love a mess. It tells so much about a person, don't you think?" With visible reluctance, Edgar led her down the hall to the cramped, dusty study. And the room was cluttered, its windows partly obscured by boxes. In the corner sat a Remington Standard, black, enamel chipped, ribbon twisted. Miss Marple moved closer. "Still working?" she asked. "Of course," he said too quickly. "May I try a few keys?" "Well, I suppose, but the ribbon's faint." She tapped the E and T keys in succession. Then R and A. The E left a faint but visible stroke. The R, however, was misaligned, rising slightly above the baseline. The A bore a small nick in the curve. As though from corrosion or impact, she did not comment. Instead, she turned, apparently fascinated by a shelf of files. "And you kept all your correspondence over the years? How thorough." "I will. I don't throw things away lightly." "Ah, sensible. You never know when the past might become relevant again." Edgar's eyes twitched toward the hallway. Later, that day, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Howard in the corner booth of the Maple and Thorn tea room, sipping weak Darjeeling and listening to the low murmur of the other patrons, though few would meet her eyes for long. She noticed that Mrs. Trenholm had taken her tea to go. Horatia Pym had passed the window and promptly turned the other way. Even the vicar, usually cordial to a fault, had offered only a tense nod. "It's building," Howard muttered. They know something's coming. "It always builds before the rain," Miss Marple replied. "People feel it. The change." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a sheet of paper. "This is the anonymous letter Alice Gibbs received. The one warning her to keep away from the crypt." Howard studied it. Typed. "Yes, on a Remington. Note the raised R and the Flaude. You're certain?" "I typed the same sequence on Edgar Hollowell's machine this morning." Howard sat back. "So he sent the letters." "He did. But that doesn't yet prove he killed Clara Finch or anyone else." "Could it have been intimidation? An attempt to frighten her off the trail?" "Possibly. But then one must ask, why try to frighten Alice as well?" Howard considered that Miss Marple lowered her voice. "Someone is frightened, Inspector. Someone who wants Clara's questions buried again. Perhaps Edgar tried to help that someone. Or perhaps he's afraid of the same thing she was." Howard looked troubled. "And the photo?" "I believe Edgar sent it, but I suspect someone gave it to him. So he's not the architect of this, just a messenger." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "In my experience, those who operate in shadows are often used by people who know how to remain just out of sight." That evening, Miss Marple walked the length of Mill Lane as the sun began to fall behind the village rooftops, casting long shadows on the footpath. She passed the vicarage and paused beneath the chestnut tree where Solomon had been found on that first troubling day Something glinted on the stone wall behind it. She stepped closer, Dot. It was a scrap of cloth torn, clinging to a thorn in the undergrowth. Dark green wool, coarse and unmistakably part of a sleeve cuff. She examined it carefully, then opened her handbag and placed it in an envelope beside the photograph. The following morning, Miss Marple received a visitor she had not expected. Lucy Minton. The girl looked pale and tired, as though she hadn't slept. Her hair, usually neat, was mussed, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "I don't know what to do," Lucy said. Miss Marple took her hand. "Come, dear. Tell me what's troubling you." Lucy glanced at the window, then back. "I lied," she whispered, "about the day Clara vanished." "I thought you might have," Miss Marple said gently. "I did go to the church that day," Lucy confessed, "but I wasn't there to pray." "No? I saw someone leave the crypt garden. They didn't see me, but I saw their coat." "What kind of coat, dear?" "Dark green tweed with brass buttons." Miss Marple's hand tightened slightly on her teacup. "Lucy," she said, "I believe you've just turned on the light in a very dark hallway." Section 9. Tea with Shadows. The following morning was curiously bright, as though the village had been scrubbed clean by the previous day's drizzle. Sunlight dappled the garden paths outside Miss Marple's cottage, but there was no lightness in the air. In Dovecote Lee, cheerful weather often arrived at the most ironic of times. Miss Marple had spent the early hours arranging the seating in her drawing-room, laying out a modest tea-seed cake, lemon-curd tarts, cucumber sandwiches cut just so, and instructing Florence, her maid, not to disturb them once the guests arrived. "There will be 4, Miss Marple had said, her voice light but firm. "Do take care with the teapot. Properly warm the pot first. 4 chairs, 4 napkins, each placed with the care of a conductor setting an orchestra dot at precisely 3:30. The first knock came at the door. Horatia Pym entered in a pale mauve frock and looked around with visible uncertainty. "You didn't say it was to be a group gathering." "No, I didn't," said Miss Marple cheerfully. "But it's always better when everyone hears the same story at once. Less confusion." Horatia's lips thinned, but she took a seat near the hearth. Next came Edgar Hollowell, looking decidedly worse for wear. His eyes had the reddened look of a man who had slept poorly, and his cuffs were ink-stained once more. "Afternoon," he muttered, barely making eye contact. Third was Widow Trenholm, as composed as ever, though there was a stiffness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. And finally, to everyone's surprise, including perhaps her own, Lucy Minton entered, her expression tight, her hands folded over one another, like a schoolgirl preparing to recite something she hoped. No one would ask for Miss Marple greeted them all with equal warmth, as if nothing unusual were afoot. "I do believe we've all been feeling the strain these past days," she began after pouring tea. "So much speculation, so much uncertainty. It's quite tiring, don't you think?" There were faint nods around the room, which is why I thought it best to bring a few of us together, she continued, her voice gentle to clear the air. Horatia made a faint scoffing sound, but said nothing. "Now, I have been wondering," Miss Marple said, her gaze drifting toward the window, "why Clara Finch was drawn so insistently to the church records. She was no historian, no genealogist, yet she pursued them with such intensity. She turned toward Widow Trenholm. "You mentioned to me once, dear, that Clara was particularly interested in the year 1889. Why do you suppose that was?" The widow blinked. "I never said such a thing." "Oh, I thought you had," Miss Marple said lightly. "Curious how one remembers things." She turned to Edgar. "And you, Mr. Hollowell, your uncle served as parish clerk, didn't he?" Edgar gave a thin, wary nod. "Do you suppose he might have known something Clara wanted to uncover? Something about the early burial records? The old crypt, perhaps? I've no idea." "Oh," said Miss Marple, sipping her tea, "but I think you might. I believe Clara Finch discovered something that frightened you, Mr. Hollowell, and that's why you wrote those letters." Edgar paled. What letters?" "Do sit still, Edgar," Horatia said irritably. "It's not as though we don't all know by now." "Do we?" asked Miss Marple. "Because I think we've been dancing around the edges of the real. Question: what was Clara about to expose that made someone desperate enough to silence her?" There was a long silence. Then Lucy Menton spoke, her voice thin but clear. "It was a burial." All eyes turned to her. "She told me just days before she died. Clara believed the records for 1889 were falsified. She thought there was a burial in the crypt that had never been officially recorded." "Whose burial?" Widow Trenholm asked sharply. Lucy shook her head. She didn't know. That's what she was trying to find out. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And someone didn't want her to." Horatia Pym stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Conjecture. And gossip. That girl Clara was meddlesome and overly imaginative. It doesn't mean she was murdered." Miss Marple's eyes remained serene. "Perhaps not. But she died shortly after trying to open the church's inner records. And someone left a hand buried above the crypt garden. Not Clara's, of course hers. Was found at the riverbank, but another hand. Older, judging by the decomposition. Possibly from 1889, Edgar whispered. "Oh, God." Miss Marple stood, retrieving an envelope from the side table. "I took the liberty of sending the photograph to a friend of mine at the museum in Basingstoke. He's confirmed that the burial site matches. A shallow grave consistent with 19th century practices, and likely disturbed in the last year." She placed the envelope on the table. No one moved. "I also found this," she continued, drawing out the scrap of dark green wool, torn on a thorn bush beside the crypt wall. There was a faint trace of church candle wax on the cuff. She looked directly at Widow Trenholm. The woman's face did not change, but her teacup trembled slightly in her hand. "Of course," Miss Marple said softly, "the crypt would have been well known to someone whose brother once worked for the diocesan archivist. Someone who might have been told a very old secret, long buried, and carried that secret for years, until a curious girl named Clara came along, asking the wrong questions." "You can't prove anything," Widow Trenholm said, voice tight. "Miss." Marple tilted her head. "I don't intend to not with force, but you've already shown something more telling than guilt." She looked to the others. "When I mentioned the cloth scrap, only one of you reacted. When I mentioned candle wax, only one of you failed to ask why that was relevant. You already knew." There was a silence, heavy and complete. Finally, Widow Trenholm set her cup down with deliberate calm. "He wasn't a bad man," she said, almost absently, "but he made a mistake. A young girl. A servant. He was the vicar's son. It would have been a scandal. Miss Marple's voice was kind. So they buried her in the crypt, quietly, and your brother altered the records. He didn't know what else to do. He was 24. And you kept the secret all these years? Yes. What happened to Clara? I didn't touch her, but I warned her. I asked Edgar to frighten her off. I begged Horatia to help me keep her away from the church. Miss Marple turned to Horatia. You knew? I suspected, Horatia admitted, her face pale. But I thought it was just youthful nonsense. I never imagined, Miss Marple raised her hand gently. There will be time for questions. But I think we now know who tried to conceal the truth and who might have used that secret as a weapon. She turned to Edgar Hollowell. There's one more thing. That photograph, you didn't take it. Someone gave it to you. Edgar nodded. A man, I never saw his face. Left it in an envelope on my doorstep. I thought it would scare the widow into confessing. Whoever it was, Miss Marple said quietly, they knew about the burial, which means the story is not quite over. She looked at Lucy, but it will be soon. Section 10, The Cat's Paw. The following day in St. Aldhelm's passed with the strange stillness that often precedes a storm. The village had grown hushed, not in mourning or fear, but in the strained anticipation of some inevitable reckoning. People went about their errands with excessive politeness and wary eyes, whispering over counters and glancing down side alleys, as though some invisible judge were preparing to pass sentence. In the garden behind St. Mary Mead's church, the bellflowers leaned against the low wall where the crypt lay hidden beneath the soil. The vicar, Reverend Cleves, had announced a temporary closure of the grounds for necessary maintenance, an excuse few questioned after the recent discoveries. No one wished to poke further into buried scandals, and fewer still dared to. Ask what Miss Marple had been doing in the crypt that morning with her neat gloves and quiet gaze. Only one person did. Were you looking for more bones, Miss Marple? Came the sharp voice of Horatia Pym, who had taken to loitering near the churchyard under the pretense of visiting her late sister's memorial plaque. Miss Marple, who had been admiring the late lavender, smiled without surprise. No, dear, not bones. Just something that might help the living come to terms with the dead. Horatia's mouth puckered. You speak in riddles. I wish you'd be plain. Oh, but it's not in the plain speaking that one finds the truth, I'm afraid. People hide behind facts more than feelings. One must watch how they behave when they think they are alone. Horatia narrowed her eyes. Well, if you're referring to Widow Trenholm, I do hope you've satisfied yourself she's the root of all this rot. I'm sick of treading on eggshells. Miss Marple regarded her mildly. Rot rarely grows from one root alone. It takes a tangle to strangle a tree. She turned and walked on, leaving Horatia behind in the fading scent of old roses and cold guilt. That afternoon, Miss Marple issued a quiet invitation to tea, not in her drawing room this time, but at the vicarage itself. Reverend Cleves had agreed, if reluctantly. I do hope this isn't to be a performance, Miss Marple. Nothing of the sort, she assured him. Merely an opportunity for people to reveal what they wish not to say. He blinked. That seems contradictory. Ah, she said, but it's astonishing what people let slip when they believe they're managing impressions. By 4 o'clock, 4 guests were once again assembled. Widow Trenholm arrived first, her usual composure slightly brittle. Then came Edgar Hollowell, nervously scanning the room as though awaiting an ambush. Lucy Minton arrived with a face set in resolution, and Horatia Pym trailed behind. Fanny herself, though the vicarage parlor was perfectly cool, Miss Marple poured the tea herself, politely declining help. "I do hope we can enjoy a moment of peaceful reflection," she began, "before I share a little story. It's about a cat." Horatia rolled her eyes. Edgar looked confused. Only Lucy leaned in slightly, sensing the story was not about felines at all. "This cat," Miss Marple said, "belonged to a rather respectable household. He was a curious fellow, liked to roam, as cats do, particularly to places he wasn't wanted. He went missing one afternoon, vanished without trace. The family assumed he had run off or met a fox." She sipped her tea and continued, "But a week later the maid noticed something odd in the garden. A bit of ribbon blue, like the cat's collar, and then a scrap of pale fabric caught in the hedge, torn as if from a sleeve. She told no one, at first not wishing to stir trouble, but soon afterward the cat was found buried under the lilac bush. Someone had struck it and buried it quickly, hoping to hide the deed." A hush fell over the room. "Do you know," Miss Marple said gently, "what revealed the culprit in the end?" No one replied. "A stain. Not blood. Ink. The murderer was a writer, a man whose hands were perpetually smudged with it. There, on the scrap of cloth, was the faint outline of a left-handed inkwell, smeared by a palm in haste. People rarely notice how unique their messes are." Edgar Halliwell choked slightly on his tea. Horatia stood up. "You cannot mean to suggest?" Miss Marple blinked innocently. "Oh, not at all. It's just a story, after all. But it does rather make one wonder, doesn't it?" There was a long, weighty silence. The air in the vicarage seemed to press inward. Then Lucy Minton spoke, quietly, but deliberately. "Clara told me she'd seen someone at the church late at night. Not a woman," she said. "A man in a dark coat, carrying a bundle. She thought it might be a cat struggling, she said. She asked him what he was doing. He told her it was nothing. But she told me, she said there was something in his voice, a strange tone, like he'd been caught." All eyes turned to Edgar. He stood too quickly, the chair skidding back. She didn't know what she saw. She was always imagining things, always scribbling in that notebook of hers like it gave her power. Miss Marple remained seated. "Clara was clever," she said, "but not reckless. She didn't confront you until she was certain, did she? That's why you followed her to the river. That's why she never came home." Edgar's voice cracked. "I didn't mean to. She just kept talking. I tried to scare her. She wouldn't stop. Said she'd found something in the crypt. Something real. She said she'd go to the bishop if she had to. He sank back into the chair, trembling. "It was an accident. She fell. I didn't push. I swear I didn't." Horatia's hand flew to her mouth. Widow Trenholm closed her eyes. "Lucy," wept silently. Miss Marple set down her cup. "I believe you didn't mean to kill her, Mr. Halliwell," she said. "But you did bury the cat. And then you tried to bury Clara's secrets, too." Later that evening, after the police had been summoned and Edgar Halliwell quietly escorted from the vicarage under Constable Lark's sober eye, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the church garden, gazing at the shadows stretching from the ancient yew. Reverend Cleves joined her. Will they prosecute? They will, she said, though I dare say it may not go to full trial. Perhaps manslaughter. Perhaps simply cover-up. But Clara Finch will have her justice. He exhaled. And the crypt? Let it be cleaned. Let the bones be blessed, whatever their name. A silence stretched between them, gentle and solemn. There was no cat, was there? He asked suddenly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, but there was always something clawing at the truth. Section 11. Threads in the dust the morning after Edgar. Hollowell's quiet confession was one of pale sunlight and unsettled spirits. The village of St. Aldhelms awoke as if blinking through a veil. Its shops opened later than usual, and conversations at doorsteps were softer, laden with the sort of unease that lingers after a long, troubling dream. The Hollowell affair had shaken the village, but not in the way scandal usually did. There was no sense of triumph in gossip, now only the echo of Clara Finch's absence and the strange stillness left in her wake. At the vicarage, Reverend Cleves stood at the drawing-room window, watching two constables remove Edgar's belongings into a nondescript black car. His study had been sealed, and Lucy Minton, after staying the night in the guest room, unable to return to the rectory alone, was now seated silently beside the hearth, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Marple sat across from her, darning a pale blue handkerchief with gentle, rhythmic precision. One might have thought she was wholly absorbed in the task until she spoke. You knew Clara had suspicions, didn't you, my dear? Lucy didn't reply immediately. Her chin was trembling slightly. She told me in confidence, Lucy said. At last, her voice faint. She said someone was moving things in the crypt. At first, she thought it was thieves, perhaps after the silver chalice. Then she thought maybe it was someone hiding something less valuable, but more damning. She didn't say who? No, just that she'd written it all down in her notebook, the small red one she always kept in her coat pocket. I begged her to tell someone official, but she said no one would listen, not without proof. Miss Marple nodded. And the notebook was never found. No, Lucy's voice broke. I think Edgar must have destroyed it. A soft tapping at the door interrupted them. Reverend Cleves opened it to find Constable Lark standing in his usual stiff-backed stance, hat in hand. Beg pardon, sir. Miss Marple, we've finished the initial search of Mr. Hollowell's rooms. Nothing immediately damning, but we did find this in the hearth ashes, not completely burned. He held out a charred piece of stiff paper, just enough to show the edge of a red cover and a few smudged lines of ink across the inside leaf. Lucy reached out for it, but Miss Marple gently took it instead. Her sharp eyes scanned the remains. Can you make out? Reverend Cleves asked. Miss Marple read aloud, softly. Crypt key returned to sacristy drawer. Horatia was seen arguing with Clara near the east wall. HP. Very distressed, warned her not to pry. There was a long pause. She suspected Horatia Pym? Lucy whispered. It seems so, Miss Marple said mildly. And I dare say she was not wrong to do so. Reverend Cleves frowned. But Edgar confessed. To Clara's death, yes. But I've always been puzzled by one thing. Why would Edgar bury the cat? The Reverend blinked. I thought you said that was metaphorical. Oh, the story I told, yes, mostly metaphor. But there was a real cat, you know. The Vicarage cat Marmalade disappeared at noon the day before Clara did. That's where all this started, remember? Miss Marple said the charred notebook remains on the table and folded her hands primly. And I believe dear Marmalade saw something he ought not to have. Or perhaps went sniffing where he shouldn't. Lucy looked up, eyes wide. Do you think someone silenced the cat because of the crypt? I do. Not Edgar, mind you. He may have been rash and clumsy, but I don't think he was cruel to animals. He loved order, books. His vices were pride and fear. But someone else in this village is quite different. Reverend Cleves said slowly, You think Horatia had something to do with the crypt being disturbed? Miss Marple smiled sadly. I believe Horatia Pym found something she had buried long ago quite literally. And I believe Clara was very close to finding it too. Later that day, Miss Marple took a slow stroll through the churchyard. The grounds were cordoned off for official purposes, but she had been granted access by the bishop himself, who had long respected her quiet efficiency, as he put it. At the east wall behind the wisteria, she knelt gently and brushed away a scattering of old leaves. There, just beneath the trellis, lay a patch of disturbed soil. Not from recent digging, but older, compacted with a faint, unnatural dip. She traced her fingers along the base of the stone wall, searching for a sign, and there it was, a loose stone. Just as I thought, she murmured. A small, hollow space lay behind it, and within, something wrapped in oilcloth. A quick glance revealed it. Letters, dozens of them, handwritten in an old-fashioned scrawl, intimate, florid, unmistakably passionate. Each signed G.F. Miss Marple's lips tightened. Geoffrey Finch, Clara's father. That evening, as dusk fell like a hush over St. Aldhelm's, Miss Marple called on Horatia Pym. The spinster's cottage was always fastidiously clean, but this time the scent of lemon oil and lavender polish seemed unusually cloying, an attempt to control, to suppress. Horatia's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. I suppose you've come for answers, she said, her voice falsely bright. I've come for truth, Miss Marple replied gently, but only what you choose to share. Horatia sat down, stiffly. You think I killed her? Miss Marple sipped her tea. No, Horatia, but I believe you kept secrets, dangerous ones, about Geoffrey Finch. Horatia flinched. You loved him once. Clara's mother didn't know, or perhaps she did too late. But you were the one he confided in after the affair, after the disgrace, the letters buried behind the crypt wall. You couldn't bear to destroy them. Horatia's eyes brimmed with tears. I buried them when she died, not out of guilt, out of heartbreak. I thought, if I left them there, it would be like laying him to rest. He was exiled, died in a sanatorium in Brittany. I never even got to say goodbye. And when Clara came sniffing, Miss Marple asked quietly, I warned her. I didn't threaten her. I couldn't bear the idea of it all being dragged into the light. She was too much like her father, always digging. Miss Marple nodded. And the cat? Horatia looked away. He kept scratching at the wall, over and over. I thought he'd found a rat nest. But then, I panicked. I didn't mean to hurt him. There was silence between them, thick as dusk. You didn't kill Clara, Miss Marple said at last, but you helped hide what she was about to uncover. Horatia nodded slowly. And now I'll have to live with that. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. We all live with things, my dear. Some we carry quietly. Some ask to be brought into the sun. Section 12. A whisper through the wisteria the following morning dawned with a faint chill in the air and unusual. Sensation for June, but perhaps not unwelcome in a village so recently unsettled. Miss Marple, wrapped in a soft gray shawl, sat in her garden overlooking the dew-beaded marigolds, sipping a modest cup of tea as the soft clip-clop of the milk cart passed down Church Lane. The events of the past few days, like the rustling leaves of the wisteria at the vicarage wall, stirred gently in her mind, each strand delicate, but forming a larger, tangled mass. A note had arrived that morning, slid under the door by someone too discreet to knock. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine and tidy, slightly angular, and trembling with haste. Miss Marple, please meet me at the rectory before luncheon. I have remembered something important. It may not be much, but I fear I may have been wrong to say nothing before. Yours sincerely, Lucy Mitten. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she read it, folding it carefully into the pocket of her cardigan. She had rather expected this. Guilt and conscience made for poor bedfellows, and Miss Minton had spent far too many nights alone lately, with both at the rectory. Lucy Minton answered the door herself. Her complexion was wan, but her hair had been carefully brushed, and her blouse buttoned to the collarless sign Miss Marple always believed of someone bracing themselves for emotional weather. They sat in the morning room. The lace curtains fluttered, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and thyme from the herb garden beyond. I didn't know what to do, Lucy said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I don't want to ruin anyone's life, Miss Marple, but I've remembered something that doesn't sit well. Miss Marple tilted her head kindly. Speak freely, my dear. Lucy twisted her hands in her lap. The morning before Clara disappeared, she was at the church polishing the brass lectern. I was helping Reverend Cleves sort through vestments. In the sacristy, Clara came in and asked if she could borrow the key to the old crypt door. She said she'd lost a ring her grandmother's and might have dropped it there during the previous week's flower rota. And Reverend Cleves gave it to her? Lucy hesitated. No, he said he didn't have it, that it was probably in the sacristy drawer, but he looked odd, pale, like he didn't expect the question. After Clara left, I asked him again about the key. He snapped at me more sharply than I'd ever heard him speak. Said it wasn't important. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And did she find the key in the drawer? Lucy nodded. She said she would try. I don't know if she ever did. Miss Marple considered this. It was becoming clearer now Clara had not only stumbled upon something sensitive, but she had also pressed the wrong person at the wrong moment. Lucy, Miss Marple said gently, did the Reverend know about Horatia Pym and Geoffrey Finch? Lucy's lips parted slightly in surprise. Yes, I believe so. He said once that Miss Pym had paid dearly for her discretion. I didn't understand at the time, but I think he's always had conflicted feelings about her. He admired her loyalty, but also resented the silence. He's very fond of Clara. Was. A long pause. The clock in the hall struck 10. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. Then it is time, she said softly. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage through the rear garden path, a shortcut that cut along a low stone wall and through the old rose arbor. The smell of lavender and sweet pea clung to the morning air. As she emerged into the side lawn, she spotted Reverend Cleves speaking with Constable Lark near the vestry door. The Reverend's expression was drawn, and as he turned, he caught sight of Miss Marple and excused himself immediately. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "Is something the matter?" "I'm afraid the matter has always been something, Reverend," she replied kindly, "even if it only now demands its reckoning." His smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Clara Finch found something in the crypt, something more than old stones or ghost stories, something that frightened her, and someone made certain she would not speak of it." A long silence passed between them. The only sound was a distant jackdaw in the trees, and the faint hiss of wind through ivy. "You think it was me?" Cleves said finally. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that it was your fear of scandal, your terror of disorder, that led you to a moment of moral weakness. Perhaps you thought you were protecting Horatia. Perhaps you thought Clara would bring disgrace to the church." His face was ashen now. "You don't know what it's like," he whispered, "to try so hard to preserve dignity, to bury a past that isn't yours but clings like ivy to your walls, ... Miss Marple said nothing. She waited. She confronted me in the crypt. I don't know how she found the letters, Horatia's letters to Geoffrey Finch. She said she was going to the bishop, that the parish deserved transparency. I told her to be careful. I said words I shouldn't have. She left angry. She never made it home." He covered his face with his hands. "I followed her, only to speak, but she slipped on the whetstone steps, hit her head. I didn't mean to ... I panicked." "And buried her?" Miss Marple asked, not unkindly, "in the churchyard near the east wall. It was dark. I thought I was saving everyone, but I've been haunted every hour since." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "You did not kill her out of malice, Reverend, but concealment of a death is still a grave matter." He nodded, numb like dot from the side. Horatia Pym stepped into view. She had come quietly, unnoticed, as was her way. Her face bore no makeup, no pretense, just a hollow grief. "You foolish man," she said softly. "You should have told me. You should have told all of us. I thought I was protecting you." "No one ever protected me," she said, "not even Geoffrey." By late afternoon, the village was in a quiet stir once more. The constables moved with grim purpose, and the east wall of the churchyard was cordoned off. Reverend Cleves had gone willingly, and the bishop had already dispatched a replacement to oversee the upcoming services. Miss Marple returned to her garden just as the sun began to set. The birds were singing their evening chorus. Marmalade the cat reappeared, thinner but alive, curled beneath the bird bath, as if nothing in the world had changed. But of course, everything had died as she sat down with a fresh cup of tea and a slice of ginger cake. She reflected not on crime, nor even justice, but on silence, on the cost of buried truths and the weight of secrets kept for others. She had always believed that human nature was constant, that people made the same mistakes in St. Aldhelm's as they did in cities or colonies or courts. But still, it saddened her, and yet life would continue. The roses would bloom, the wisteria would return, and someone would always remark on how peculiar it had all been. Miss Marple, for her part, merely sipped her tea and thought quietly of Clara Finch and the whisper beneath the wisteria that had finally Ben heard Section 13, beneath the parish, calm the days that followed Reverend Cleves's quiet confession were marked not by frenzy, but by a stillness that settled over St. Aldhelm's like the first frost of winter. The villagers spoke in hushed tones and wore expressions of awkward sympathy whenever they passed the church. No one seemed to know quite what to feel, not shock, precisely, nor outrage. What remained was more complex, the disquiet of realizing that tragedy had not come from outside, but had grown quietly, stubbornly, beneath their very noses. On the third morning, the parish newsletter was released as usual, though its first page bore a simple message in the bishop's handwriting. The Lord sees what is hidden. May we, too, have the courage to look. There was no mention of Clara Finch's death or the burial of her notebook, but beneath the neatly printed liturgical notices and flower rota assignments, a sense of finality clung like a watermark. Miss Marple, for her part, remained uncharacteristically quiet. She neither offered opinions nor recounted the drama to curious callers. Instead, she spent her mornings knitting by the window and her afternoons strolling along the green, exchanging polite pleasantries with Mrs. Barton about meringue consistency, and with Mr. Kell the grocer about his wilting rhubarb. But even in her reticence, Miss Marple was watching, and she was not the only one. Late that Thursday afternoon, Lucy Minton arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, pale and visibly unsettled. She carried a brown envelope, clutched tightly in one hand, and didn't speak until she had taken a sip of the tea Miss Marple offered her. "I found something in Reverend Cleves's old sermon files," she said softly, in a folio marked, "Confidential, August. I wouldn't have looked, truly I wouldn't, but the bishop asked me to organize things." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "And what did you find, my dear?" Lucy placed the envelope on the table between them and gently pushed it across. "Letters, but not from Horatia. These are from Clara." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "She never sent them," Lucy continued. "Their draft some with red ink crossed out. But one thing stood out. In every letter she mentioned someone by initials. A.B.? A.B.? Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Not G for Geoffrey Finch?" Lucy shook her head. "No, and she keeps referencing a promise broken and something about money. She never says it directly, but I think she believed someone was being blackmailed. Double quotes." Miss Marple sat back slowly. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the fading sunlight turned the hedgerows gold. "How curious," she murmured. "Clara was many things, but she was not reckless. If she mentioned a promise, she meant it was sacred." Lucy hesitated. "There's something else. I didn't think it was important at first, but 2 days. Before she disappeared, I remember she said something strange." "What was that?" "She said you'd be surprised what cats see when no one is watching." Miss Marple's hands stilled. Lucy's voice trembled. "I think Clara saw something more than just letters or gossip or secrets from the past. I think she saw someone breaking that promise, someone very much alive." That same evening, the sound of an unexpected knock echoed through the hallway of Hollowell House. Horatia Penn, who had lived with a veil of self-possession so long it had become second nature, opened the door wearing her usual slate-gray cardigan. An iron-stiff demeanor. She didn't expect to see Miss Marple. "May I come in, Horatia?" the older woman asked softly. Horatia stepped aside without a word. The drawing room smelled faintly of peppermint lozenges and the dry, floral scent of pressed books. The curtains were drawn half shut, casting the space in a soft mauve light. "Came to return something," Miss Marple said. She reached into her handbag and produced a small, weathered envelope. Horatia's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" "Clara's drafts," Miss Marple said simply. "Unsent letters." Horatia took the envelope with trembling fingers. She opened the top, brows furrowing as she scanned the top page. Her mouth parted slightly. "I didn't." "No." Miss Marple was quiet. She knew about Albert, Horatia said at last, sitting slowly on the edge of the armchair. "Albert?" Miss Marple echoed, her tone gentle. "My younger brother," Horatia said with difficulty. "We don't speak. Haven't for 20 years. There was a scandal, money gone missing from the diocesan trust fund. Father covered it up, sent him to the colonies. But Clara knew. He must have come back. I never told anyone he had returned. I didn't know myself." Miss Marple's eyes grew sharper. "But someone else did." Horatia nodded slowly. "Yes, and if Clara confronted them, she might have been silenced." "Not by Reverend Cleves," Miss Marple said gently. "No," Horatia agreed, folding the letters in her lap. "Not by him." There was a long pause between them. Then Miss Marple stood, collecting her gloves. "I believe the time for quiet. Reflection is nearly over," she said. "Some truths do not stay buried even in churchyards." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit the small lamp beside the hearth and sat down with a fresh notebook. She opened it and wrote a single word. At the top of the page, Albert. Beneath it, she began listing clues. Clara's knowledge of a financial scandal, the cat's disappearance near the crypt, a forged donation check from Hollowell, house to the bishop's bursary, the initials A.B., a false trail pointing toward Horatia and Reverend Cleves, the anonymous note sent to Clara. A week before her death, Miss Marple tapped her pen against the table. Albert Beechcroft. That had been the name. Years ago, on the diocesan register before it disappeared from official records, a disgraced clerk, hidden by his family, erased by the church. But what if he had returned? What if he had been hiding in plain sight under a borrowed name, posing as someone else? Miss Marple rose slowly and crossed to the window. The stars had begun to prick the navy sky, and beyond the vicarage roof, the silhouette of the church steeple stood like a silent sentinel dot in the hush of the night. The truth hovered just out of reach. But she knew it would come. It always did. With calm certainty, she turned out the lamp. Tomorrow, she would set the last piece in motion. Final section. The truth behind the curtains. The village of St. Aldhelms stirred with anticipation on the first clear morning following a week of storms. A pale sun gilded the roofs and glistened in the puddles along Mill Lane. Birds sang with renewed vigor in the ivy-covered churchyard, and even the chapel bells rang a little brighter than usual, as if they too sensed that something long unsettled was about to be laid to rest. In the vicarage parlor, Inspector Craythorne sat stiffly, not out of discomfort, but in that particular way policemen have when unsure whether they've missed something obvious. He had been summoned by Miss Marple, ever polite, ever precise, to join her for tea, along with Lucy Minton, Horatia Pym, and one other individual whose presence was rather more surprising, Mr. Tobias Gray, the bishop's bursar. "I must," say Miss Marple, began Craythorne as he stirred his cup. "Your message was rather cryptic. You suggested we revisit the question of the missing cat to uncover a murderer. I do hope this isn't another of your analogies." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Oh no, Inspector, the cat was quite real, as was the reason it vanished." Horatia Pym said nothing, seated near the fireplace, her eyes lowered but listening intently. Miss Marple continued, "It always seemed strange to me that Clara Finch would disappear so completely and without any of the usual signs of planning or despair, and then to have poor Wycliffe, the cat, vanish shortly after. It begged the question, what connected the two?" The others waited. Tobias Gray cleared his throat, but remained otherwise composed. Miss Marple set her teacup down. "As it turns out, Clara Finch stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. You see, she had been observing more than wildflowers and tithing irregularities in the parish ledgers. She had begun to track inconsistencies in donations, particularly a series of forged checks from Hollowell House to the Diocesan Bursary Fund. Gray stiffened slightly. "I'd wondered how Reverend Cleves, a man of some integrity, came to accept those contributions without question. It wasn't him. It was someone who knew how to look like a trusted church official." Her gaze turned fully to Tobias Gray. "You aren't Tobias Gray, are you?" she said gently. "That man died in a sanitarium outside Bath in 1947. You assumed his name, but you were born Albert Beechcroft, weren't you? Former clerk of the diocesan office, disgraced, vanished." Gray Beechcroft stood too quickly, knocking his cup. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You have no proof of that." "Clara Finch did," Miss Marple replied calmly. "She remembered your face from a photograph in the old diocesan archives, and she matched your handwriting, your signature on the donation receipts, to letters you'd written before the scandal. She came to confront you. She told Horatia she was going to Hollowell House that night. She never returned." Lucy gasped. "You confronted her in the chapel vestry," Miss Marple said softly. "She thought you would confess. Instead, you panicked. When she reached into her satchel for her notebook, you struck her, perhaps not even intending to kill her. But the blow was fatal. Beechcroft's face had gone waxy and pale. She fell, and in your haste to cover your crime, you hid the body beneath the old crypt. You thought no one would find her, not with the entrance long sealed. But someone did find her." Craythorne leaned forward. "The cat." Miss Marple nodded. "Wycliffe was a curious creature, wasn't he? He often snuck into the church through the loose panel near the apse. That's where he caught your scent. The second time, he'd followed Clara in earlier that week, but now he smelled something familiar and unsettling. He meowed and scratched at the crypt until Lucy noticed and alerted the groundskeeper. You didn't expect a cat to betray you, did you, Mr. Beechcroft?" Gray's facade cracked. "It was an accident," he said suddenly. "I didn't mean to kill her. Why, she threatened everything. My name, my second chance. I couldn't let her expose me. Inspector Craythorne." "Rose, that's enough. We'll need a formal statement." Beechcroft didn't resist as he was led out, his steps slow, as though he carried the full weight of 20 years of lies on his shoulders. Later that evening, the sun cast long golden shadows over St. Aldhelm's, and the village began to breathe. Again, Clara Finch was quietly reinterred beside her parents in the churchyard, a modest headstone marking her final place. Wycliffe the cat, dignified as ever, watched the ceremony from the vicarage wall, blinking slowly as if satisfied that justice had at last been done. Inside the drawing room, Miss Marple sipped her evening tea as Lucy Minton placed a small vase of daisies on the windowsill. "You think people will remember her kindly?" Lucy asked. "Some will," Miss Marple replied. "Others will prefer to forget, but that's the way of things in villages. Truth doesn't always suit everyone's comfort." Lucy nodded thoughtfully. She didn't deserve to die. "No," Miss Marple agreed softly, "but she did deserve to be heard, and now she has been." There was a brief silence, filled only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the chirrup of sparrows in the garden hedge dot. Then Lucy smiled faintly. "And the cat?" Miss Marple gave a small chuckle. "Oh, I dare say Wycliffe's earned his place in the annals of village lore, whether he knows it or not." Aftermath a month later, the village of St. Aldhelm's returned to its quiet rhythm, though the bells at St. Aldhelm's rang with a deeper echo, as if touched by remembrance. Horatia Pym stepped down from the vestry committee, and was seen tending to the churchyard flowers more frequently, always alone. Lucy Minton was offered a post at the diocesan archives in Winchester, and left with a letter of recommendation penned by Miss Marple herself. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her garden, her knitting, and her shrewd observations. When asked if she'd ever consider writing a book about her cases, she merely smiled and said, "Oh, goodness, no. What could be more tedious than having everyone know what you know before you've had your tea?" And so the mystery of the vicarage cat was laid to rest, its whiskered witness forever silent, its truth unraveled not by force or forensic, but by the quiet, persistent wisdom of an old lady with an eye for human nature.